you going to kick us off?
Well, thank you, Nikos. Personal introduction. My name's Gordon Kerr from Compton Partners, a small business unit focused on addressing the financial problems, particularly of the Eurozone. And those who attended the first session would obviously have heard of the strong wisdom of adopting more or less the present policies in dealing with the present crisis in Ukraine. But turning to the slightly different angle posed by the subject, when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. One thought that does occur to me is that, of course, a great number of goods in volume terms have been crossing Ukraine's borders for the last few years. It's known as the breadbasket of the world, if not Europe, if not the world. Something like 12%, I believe, of the world's wheat and similar amounts of barley are produced by Ukraine, and that doesn't seem to have stopped the aggressors. And it could just be the case that we're dealing with individuals of such extreme, violent, militaristic, territorial ambitions. In many ways, of course, Putin has been compared to other genocidal dictators of the 20th century. But one of the consequences, thinking about some of the very erudite contributions in the first session, that I think we're being faced may not have occurred to a number of people, which is, how are we going to pay for goods throughout Europe and in the rebuilding of Ukraine when this all settles down? I can see the arguments. You don't want to have a second Versailles Treaty and therefore risk the creation of a second Putin in the next 20, 30 years. By the same token, we're dealing with a Europe that is so indebted, almost beyond imagination. The crises, as we were discussing, Nikos, in the break, of Greece has simply been bailed away. It's been printed away, and there seems to be no restriction at all. I'm looking at an article that appeared in the Institute of Research, Economic and Fiscal Issues website last week, Enrico Colombato, by a colleague of mine, Bob Liddon. The Euro system itself now owns 7 trillion of European public debt. I think there only is 10 or 11 trillion of European public debt, and I'm not exactly sure how public debt is issued these days. There seems to be a never-ending stream of institutions that are simply being created with the intention of then issuing further public debt that falls not directly but through a system of guarantees on most of the taxpayers of Europe through a literal incredible array of organizations. People will be familiar with the European Stabilization Mechanism, the European Investment Bank, so on and so forth. But the Pandemic Emergency Fund, now at 1.6 trillion, was only even dreamed up in March 2020 with the kind of COVID situation, but it's already become almost as large as the GDP of the UK over 3 or 4 years. I just think that the continued operation of the Euro system, the Euro itself, at negative real interest rates of 7, 8, 9, 10%, and the continuing implication of the costs of settlement of this war when it goes forward is going to have some implication on the flow of goods for the post-Ukraine war situation. And therefore, I seriously hope that for the sake of Europe and European peace, we can find a means to enable goods to continue to cross borders in the non-warring part of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So the title of the topic today is a cool quote. So I will start my talk with another cool quote. So in '96, David Friedman says, "No two countries who both have McDonald's restaurants have ever gone to war." Now, this was already not the case because Serbia had McDonald's when NATO was bombing it. But his point was that economic interconnectedness and economic relations is preventing war, or could be a factor in preventing war. Is this the case? I will be on the skeptical side. Because I don't think that the cause of war, the root of war, is economics. I mean, I grew up as a Marxist. I always thought that war is about imperialism and economic interests, but I've changed my mind. So even if we see it empirically, think about World War I. The world was never so much interconnected as before World War I. This was in a way the first notion of globalization that we had. Did this prevent the war? No. Let's think about World War II. Even Germany and Soviet Union were very useful to each other in terms of their trade in the years leading to war. Did this prevent the war? No. Or thinking about it this way, nothing is more economically integrated than a country itself. An example would be Yugoslavia. Did this stop the Serbs than saying we want to kill the Croats and vice versa? And the answer, of course, is no. And why is all this? Because, again, people don't go to war over economic concerns. Now, of course, economic cooperation can help. I'm in Greece, and I know that we had very hostile attitudes to this country on the north that we called Skopje, that they called themselves Macedonia, and for decades there would be conflict with each other. What actually stopped this hostility, or what ameliorated this hostility, was Greeks going to casinos above the borders because they were cheaper, or Greeks doing business in that country. Now we've agreed we're going to call it North Macedonia, and we're a bit better friends than we used to be. So if it's not economic interests that lead to wars, what is it that leads to wars? And the answer is bad ideas. I mean, the line is money makes the world go round. Actually, this is not the case. Ideas make the world go round. And if you see every conflict, you find very bad ideas behind it. For example, if actually wars were fought on economics, the Arabs would not hate Israel that much. Instead of wanting to kill Israelis, they would want to do business in Tel Aviv, because this would be to their economic interest. But economic interest is not what motivates them. I would say every dictator who ever launched a war, or even when democracies engage in war with each other because of nationalism, their interest goes beyond economic, because there's nothing to be gained from a war. I mean, if you're a Steve Jobs, you're someone with the esteem of an entrepreneur, you don't expect to loot your neighbor. You expect to cooperate with them, you expect to produce, and you expect to exchange. It's the mentality of the thug, of a Saddam Hussein, of a dictator, of someone who doesn't believe in things like win-win trade, who go after war. So what are the ideas that lead to war? The obvious one is collectivism. This idea that, and this unfortunately is not only popular among dictators, this idea that my life doesn't belong to myself, it belongs to you fill in the blank, my class, my race, my nation. For example, in Greece, you are conscripted to the army. This means that for 9 months, your life is not yours. This means that you have to sacrifice for Greece. Now, this is not miles and miles away from the mentality of someone to tell you, go attack another country, or go and die for your country in terms of attacking another country. Because the common theme is the idea that you have to live and die for something else than yourself. This is an opinion which is also quite popular among conservatives. I hear Jordan Peterson always saying, you have to live for something bigger than yourself. What is that? I don't want to live for something bigger than what I value. It means I might value my family, my friends, I might appreciate my country, but I'm not going to die about it. So this idea that there's something that you have a duty to sacrifice yourself for a tribe, for a group, for a collective, this is what is behind wars. Even wars that we consider, quote, good wars. Why does an American have the duty to go and fight in Vietnam? What for? To sacrifice for the South Vietnamese? Why did an American have a duty to go to Iraq, for example? But again, it's this idea that you have to live for something bigger and we have a duty. No, I don't have duties that I haven't chosen for myself. And again, in nationalism, you find this in its extreme. The idea that sacrifice is something which is good. Do you think that these people actually do care about and have like economic gain in their minds? In some ways, I wish the left's implicit take that, yeah, wars are about capitalists gaining money. I wish this was the case, because then very soon we wouldn't have wars. We wouldn't have wars anymore. So, and that's also important to understand, not only when we discuss wars, but also when we discuss economics and when we discuss how to spread the ideas that are very valuable to us. Because people are not going to go to the barricades for GDP, or they're not going to go to the barricades by us trying to convince them that if we put tariffs down 2%, then your earnings are going to go up. No, people are inspired by ideas. And that's the thing, we have very, very good ideas. So this is how we should advocate our ideas, that they lead to a fulfilling life, and they lead to a life that then you don't need to sacrifice yourself or others to yourself. So to cut a long story short, two countries that have McDonald's, to paraphrase Friedman, would not go to war only if they both understand what lies behind something like McDonald's. The idea of trade and the idea that your life is yours and it's going to become better when you deal with other rational people and you don't need to loot anyone, or you are not the sacrificial lamb to anyone else. Thanks. It's on again.
Thank you very much, Nikos. I think I would like to add something right away to that, what you mentioned. We also need to make a huge difference whether we are talking about revolutions or whether we are talking about like really wars between countries, whether it's a revolution within a country, what we have seen, for example, in the Ukraine itself, or whether the Ukraine is having a war, fighting a war, or defending itself with another nation. And if we look at, especially, say, 1848 in Austria, Germany, the libertarian pro-market revolution, when people were literally going on the barricades to fight for their own freedom, this was definitely something different than the fight that we had 10 years later, probably in Lombardy, or 15 years later. So those things need to be also seen from a different angle. But let me rephrase Bastiat's famous quote, "When goods cross borders, weapons won't." Why shouldn't we look at it these days with when energy, when natural resources don't cross borders, weapons will? And I was in preparation for this year's free market roadshow, was looking into the trade numbers and figures, because I'm a true believer in facts and figures, and especially in times like that when we see fake news and cancel culture and people who tell us what we need to believe and who decide what is right or wrong. I think we need to definitely look at the facts and figures in order to be on the safe side. And I was looking at the transatlantic relations prior to COVID, and especially to the trade numbers before that. So I was looking at the US-EU trade, and in terms of the developments and the structural actual trade flows. And also looking at the Chinese trade flows, both with the EU and with the US. And guess who had more trade with China, the US or Europe? What do you think? Well,
the European Union?
Yes. EU and the US trade was accounted to 5.2% of the world trade back then. And China and the EU had a global trade volume of 4.6%, and China and the US was 4.3%. So this was, of course, prior to COVID. But what was even more interesting, and this is also relevant to what we have heard in the panel number one, when Dan and the others also mentioned that there was a much more positive approach towards China. Back then, EU-US trade had fallen from 6.5% to the 3% because of much more trade with China. Having said that, I would also look into other numbers that were mentioned already by Gordon, the sovereign debt crisis and the amount of money that we have seen being in circulation or being put on the table by various institutions. And it's not only the EU itself, it's not only the European Central Bank, but it's also IMF and World Bank that have put a lot of aid on the table to support and help Russia, to support actually Ukraine, sorry. And the question is, who will pay the price for that? And I'm just giving you those numbers. So Ukraine receives 1.2 billion in emergency financial assistance from the EU. Then we have heard already this huge sanction package. However, I have to say that if we look at the history of sanctions, we totally know that this is a two-sided sword, because in the end, the target of is never hit. It's always other people that suffer, and it's the man on the street that suffers from a sanction from both sides. Those countries who impose the sanctions and those who are kind of the recipients or the targets of the sanctions. Other numbers, EBRD. So Ukraine receives also 2.2 billion in emergency financial assistance, which is loan extensions, liquidity assistance, and trade finance. Then the board of directors proposes from EBRD proposes also indefinite suspensions of all access of Russia and Belarus to this institution, which is again a question of how will they come back to democracy, if ever. I mean, we're also talking about a long process. The consequences of this war and of, the not being able that goods can cross those borders anymore will destroy not only Russia, but it will destroy the Ukrainian economy totally, but also the European economy. If we now see that the supply chains are more or less blocked again, because of the lack of resources, of natural resources. And we know that our European industry, whether it's Germany that needs gas for their production sites and plants, or all across Europe, because we are not self-sustainable, we will have to live with a much lower economic growth. We had picked up after COVID in January and last quarter of 2021, pretty much in the first January and the beginning of February, we had recovered in Europe, but now we're back again to a stop, and we've seen numbers from various institutions across the world that show growth rates that are not only negative, but in two-digit numbers negative. So this is a huge issue and a problem for us all. So coming back to another point that is also relevant for that is, and what we have seen in the past couple of months, or actually year already rising, is inflation. And we now see politicians who blame the war in Ukraine for the high inflation rates, which is totally not true. There are three drivers for inflation. One is demand, another is supply, and then the shortages. And of course, there is one special effect that we have also seen is the climate policy, the so-called Green Deal, that has also triggered inflation because we were too slow in picking up innovation and new technologies. Having said that, I think I provided a couple of numbers that we should also discuss when we talk about goods, free trade, and borders. And last sentence, the European Union, as we've seen with the 4 European freedoms, that have not been in place during the COVID times should also set us thinking. You mentioned prior to World War I, we were much freer. It was easier to travel from St. Petersburg to Lisbon, or wiring money, or not wiring, but sending money from London to Athens, or having the famous Polish plumber work in Germany. Those things were much easier. And this is actually the form of freedom that we should look for, and that we should defend, and not others.
Yep. No disagreement here. Razi, shall we go to the questions, or shall we have an inter-panel discussion first? Okay, actually, I have one comment on what. So you mentioned the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
I think environmental policies and how popular they were are the proof in what I claim, that people are not this homo economicus, which is this stereotype that the left has made, that, oh, you quote neoliberals think that people, for the wrong reasons, they are right. People are not mostly motivated by economic interest. Of course, when it hits their pocket, hopefully they will see through the problem with the green agenda. But because the green agenda is in accordance with what they consider as the good, oh, I'm going to sacrifice for Mother Earth or whatever, they are in defense of it. And something similar, I wouldn't be surprised, happens in Russia at the moment. They're saying, look, of course we are suffering economic difficulties, but my duty to Russia is more important. Or the fact that, in a way you could say, suffering for my country gives me this moral virtue. It's something good. And if you think who are Putin's biggest ideological allies, it's the church, who I don't think they're going to care that much about the fact that the Russian GDP is going to go down, and some oligarchs who didn't become rich via what McCluskey calls trade test and enrichment. They didn't. So it's not that they're missing this free space of the free economy because this is how they made their fortunes. So I don't think that merely by the fact that this war is going to be costly to Russia, that this is going to have a big effect in Putin. I wish it did, but history shows otherwise. I mean, if people were voting based on what is good for their pocket, would Greece vote for statist politicians from 1974 till today? I don't know.
They don't know about public choice theory and about Jim Buchanan. That's about it. I mean, if you give handouts to people all the time and not telling them that it's actually their own money that is being spent, I mean, this is the huge lie, and this is why we have to constantly ask the question: what is the task of government? And what does government really have to finance apart from the legal system or the rule of law, the basic conditions, and nothing else? I mean, that's the question. How far do we go, and how far are we willing to pay for it? Because it's our money that is being used there, and it's not other people's money. I mean, since Lady Thatcher has been quoted today already, I mean, she once mentioned, eventually they will run out of other people's money, and this will be the end of socialism. Unfortunately, she was right in many things, but we have seen them do other things, whether it's the Federal Reserve or whether it's the European central banks. On national banks, there's always a way out of this limitation, unfortunately.
But the end of socialism is not coming unless socialism loses its legitimacy in the battle of ideas. And they're winning big time. So, again, it's if by winning the economic argument we'd have won, then there would be no socialist on earth since, I don't know, when did Hayek and Mises wrote their stuff. But they still win because they have the moral high ground, and partially we are to blame on that because the freedom movement, or however you want to call it, because we don't fight the battle there. We don't go to them and say, look, you're morally wrong. We go to them with arguments about economics were super important, but again, no one is going to barricades for economics. Young people don't sign up to Extinction Rebellion based on economic arguments. They think it's the moral thing, and that's, again, the field where we have to fight a bit harder, I think.
You can take this one as well.
Sorry. Thank you. Well, picking up on this brief sojourn over the last 100 years of wartime history and how money was affected and goods were affected, I think I agree with Barbara very much so that the issue is the soundness of finances. And in fact, you could clearly relate, as I know the Cotton Centre did when it first established itself in 2009. One of the strongest arguments for sound money is that it makes wars very difficult to take place. And there's been a great deal of media here in the UK, obviously about Second World War and First World War, given the Ukraine crisis. There was even a TV series, 2 parts, a couple of weeks ago, Could Hitler Have Been Stopped? By coincidence, I was rereading A.J.P. Taylor's wonderful 1961 book, The Origins of the Second World War, in which he points out not only were there only really 2 interwar years between 7th of March 1936, when Hitler retook the Rhineland, and then sadly 11th of March 38, when Austria was Anschluss and so forth. But one of the reasons that Taylor attributes to Hitler's failure was not only the brilliance of Churchill and so forth, but also because Germany was in the mid to late 30s still so vividly aware of the collapse of the currency in 1923 that he was reluctant and chose not to spend as much money on rearming as Churchill and Chamberlain were claiming that it was at the time, and Germany entered the Second World War seriously short of resources and were planning to wait until 1943 before hostilities really took off. And that really made me think about the situation today. Does anybody really think that anybody in the West is worried about the cost of the bombs and missiles and so on and so forth? You mentioned green policies. I mean, how seriously does Putin worry, hot on the heels of attending the Glasgow COP26 conference last autumn? How much is he worried about the carbon footprint of every one of these ballistic missiles that he lobs into these tremendous terrible apartment blocks in the city and so forth? Furthermore, the theme here of this brief discussion is the interplay between seemingly minor geopolitical issues and the consequence of trade, money, and possible wars. You mentioned Macedonia, and of course, being Greek, I defer to you. But I also have a relatively strong, personal presence in Sofia, Bulgaria, which I think could play some kind of role as in the epicenter of the coming euro currency crisis, because obviously things are really not looking very sound in the eurozone. And one of the main issues the audience may not be aware of is right now, both Croatia and Bulgaria are well advanced on the path to supposedly joining the eurozone, adopting the euro. Eamon mentioned in the first conference that the European Union has its project. You have to join the euro. Well, that doesn't actually seem to me to be the case. I can't see Viktor Orban dropping the forint in Hungary very soon, nor can I see Poland dropping the zloty. And you mentioned Macedonia itself. Well, of course, they had a referendum, I think, in 2018, which changed the name from former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia to Republic of North Macedonia. And that was the one single policy of Zoran Zaev, extremely unpopular with a number of Macedonians, but it worked. It's bought off Greece. Greece no longer objects to Macedonia joining the European Union. However, Bulgaria still does. And what I'm hearing from my kind of channels in Sofia is that now Bulgaria's chance of the wonderful benefits of Eurozone membership, pause for dramatic effect, may hinge on them making a geopolitical decision to drop their 120-year objection to Macedonia having its own status.
Which in the end means that it's about economics, and it's not only about power, which is part of it, but economics also drives those things. If people starve because they are hungry, and which we have seen, we've seen mass migration in Europe. We have seen those problems not only once but over centuries, And so it is about good economics. It's about sound politics that allow countries and individuals especially to prosper and grow. And this is why we need a framework. And for us, pro-market, libertarian people, I think a solid framework is where the power of government is limited and where we have the rule of law in place and where enterprises can work and can collaborate together, because after all, it's about the division of labor that has gotten us big. And talking about trade, what we see these days is managed trade. This doesn't have anything to do with free trade. These are agreements internationally organized, done with a lot of bureaucracy. Maybe we should ask, couldn't this be done in a different way? Shouldn't we allow enterprises to make their own decisions?
So, shall we go to let's go to the audience first, and just as a food for thought, you mentioned free trade. I would also ask, why is this tribalism, the conservative movement, particularly in the US, against free trade? So we had the economists for centuries trying to show that trade is win-win. And now you have all the big names in American conservatism, particularly the culture warriors, saying, oh no, trade is, when we trade with China, they win, we lose. But let's go to the audience, and we might come back to that. Is this working?
Yeah, don't touch the button.
No, it was close. I have that. Give it a second to go green.
Okay, perfect.
How would go to?
I have to wait a little bit. Okay, now it's green. Nico
Yes.
mentioned that he was a former Marxist. And Karl Marx said, proletariat of the world, unite. That didn't stop World War I. The workers, the German workers, killed French workers, British workers. But going back to what the other two panelists say, doesn't economics, although economics might not be the main driving force, doesn't economics create the political situations for the rise of the Messiah? 1929, New York, Black Friday, Germany, the loans made by the Americans are called back, the German economy sinks, and 4 years later, Hitler rises to power.
So does the crisis lead to the rise of a Hitler or a strongman? The answer is that the crisis opens a field. So for example, in the opening stages of the crisis in Greece, for the first time you heard free market voices. But also for the first time you had fascists like Golden Dawn having their voice heard. Fast forward 5 years, the fascists were at like 10%, the radical left was in power, and freedom ideas were at something like 2%. So what the crisis does is it opens a space. But then again, in Greece, which is a country where the church is very powerful, where this idea that working is a necessary evil, or this idea that someone becomes rich by making someone else poor, is it a surprise that when you had all these ideas being strong for decades before the crisis, that when the crisis came, most people were either to the radical left or to the radical right? So there is no deterministic thing that says that when the crisis comes, a strong man will be there. It's just that then you have the ideas that are already strong finding a fertile ground. So again, at the end of the day, it's about the battle of ideas. I don't disagree with anything that you said, Barbara, so this is not a discussion on whether free trade is good. It's a discussion on, are we going to win the battle of ideas with an economic argument? And my take is no.
But we still have to use economic arguments as well,
Sure.
because you have various sets of people, those who reflect to numbers, those who reflect to economic arguments, those who reflect to, say, sheer forces of capitalism, which is nothing else but the protection of property rights, by the way, and those who reflect to ideas and everything. You know, we believe in individualism, and each and everybody of us has different advantages and ideas and preferences. Luckily, if we were all the same, it would be boring and it wouldn't work. Luckily, we are different, and there is no such thing as one size fits all, whether it's in politics or whether it's in the EU or whether it's within our society. And so there is no single solution to that topic, of course. However, and since you challenged us here, and we've been working to at least spread the word of freedom and the word of the ideas of freedom, and there is no single philosopher who you can use. There is plenty of philosophies that you can approach free markets or the idea of a free society, whether it's starting out with Adam Smith or with the scholastics in Spain or in many other regions of the world. Other dynasties have seen the development of freedom 3,000 years ago. It's not only us here in Europe that we have had this on our agenda for the past 2,000 years. Or more, a little bit more probably. But there are various angles to touch it. And what we have done in I would say in the European freedom movement is, as you mentioned, we debate from a very intellectual point of view. We don't approach people with the look and feel and of what the advantages of being a free individual. And here we've seen what the former Soviet countries in Europe, the former Eastern Bloc countries have suffered. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, they had to turn around just 180 degrees to embrace freedom and market ideas and get the notion of really individualistic freedom and also be able to run their own enterprises. We in the West, in Western Europe, should have turned around 90 degrees, but we did not. We were all spoiled. And we have been spoiled also by our socialist welfare states. And that cost us a lot of money, and that the results of which we actually suffer. And with each and every external shock, whether it's financial crisis where we had to bail out countries, which actually was a sovereign debt crisis, or whether it's the COVID crisis, another external shock, or now the war. Those debts build up, and we will sooner or later, we either will have to pay them back. I'd rather say sooner than later. But the question is, how can we manage that? And this is why we need to have sound and solid economics as an underpinning as well. So it's not only one argument, it's many arguments that we need to use.
Thanks. I have nothing to add to that. Go to the next question.
So, yeah, there's no disagreement here. But, for example, what did the right-wing government do in Greece after the radical left was in power? They said...
Free markets.
They not only said that, they said, look, the left is right, of course, in their morality. We understand that equality is important. So basically they're saying the left is correct in everything except their economics. This is music to the ears of the left because, again, they don't win by their sound economics. They win by their appeal to morality, and unfortunately the right is not addressing it. Imon, yeah.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I could maybe synthesize these views a little. firstly, on a logical point, I mean, what Bastiat is supposed to have said, although he didn't, is that if goods don't pass borders, then soldiers will. That's not the same. That still leaves it open to the possibility that if goods do go across borders, you still may get conflicts. And indeed you do. Trading nations do go to war. You can't think of many examples. There are some examples, but it can happen. It's probably less likely because the idea is that the citizens have a stake in peace, in trading, and they have a stake in liberal values. When you look at trading nations, they tend to have liberal values. Now, they have liberal values and institutions. They tend to be tolerant countries. They tend to have individual and civil rights and civil equality. They tend to have rule of law, and they tend to have property rights, very importantly, as Barbara said. It may not be the fact that they're trading nations that cause those things. It may be, and it's, to my mind, it's much more likely that it's because countries adopted those liberal values that they enjoy the benefits of trade, because things like property law and the rule of law allow you to trade. So it seems to me that the economic argument is actually very convincing to people. People want to get rich. You know, people want to get themselves out of poverty. People want to become prosperous. What we've got to do is to say that in order to do that, you've got to adopt liberal values. You've got to adopt these you've got to have these institutions and the rule of law, property, individual rights, and all of that sort of stuff. And if you do that, then you'll get rich. But it's adopting the values that's going to make you rich, and it's adopting those values which is much more likely to prevent conflict. Because if we all share those values, then there's no reason why we should get into conflict at all.
Oh, no, I meant I'll take it for...
But actually, let me ask you something back, Amy. So why do you think then that we haven't been able to persuade people for these values for all these decades? I mean, our economics are sound. We have the best economies from... So the economic argument has been won already from von Bawerk, I would say. And yet, Sorry? Well, but why does then that the nationalists and the socialists still are a force to be reckoned with? Is it that we just need to inform people about sound economics in a stronger way, or is it something else?
I think that nationalism is very deep in the human consciousness. We as liberals might wish it weren't, but it is, and you have to recognize that. So, you know, when you're looking for the causes of conflict, that is definitely one of them. The other problem, of course, is that our system of economics is actually pretty hard to understand. It's very easy. Barbara was talking about, you know, why is it that every economist believes that free trade is the bee's knees, but nevertheless, politicians are always talking about protectionism and so on. You look at Trump and so on and so on. That's because it's easy to understand. It's easy to make an argument, we need to protect American jobs, we're going to stop steel coming into America. It's much more difficult to say, well, if you do that, then there's going to be all these consequences, the price of cars is going to rise and consumers are going to be worse off and so on. But that takes another sort of explanation. It's moving you from a simple explanation into one which is more complicated and incredibly complicated, actually, because the results of any one trade embargo on steel, for example, in America's case, or food, anything like that, can be extremely profound and can go on for many, many, many years, and indeed cause conflicts throughout the world. So it's the complexity of the argument that is the problem. We've got to find ways of dressing up complicated arguments in much more simple language.
Let me read an online question and then we'll see if there's any final comments from the audience. So I will ask this question straight to the economists of the panel because you will be in a much better position to understand it. So, given Russia's recent reversion to economic blackmail taxes on energy, as opposed to free trade in energy, and if we connect the dots to So basically the question is, what are the impacts of Russia's invasions for global supply chains, taking into accordance, of course, Russia's, how much they rely on energy and how much we rely on their energy. And our friend says, more specifically, food supplies, but also Ukraine's energy, fertilizers, and many other commodities, minerals, titanium, and mercury. So our friend here really knows his economics. So what's going to be the impact on supply chains, Barbara?
Well, Thank you very much. Well, the impact on supply chains is tremendous, is enormous, as I already mentioned before. If we look at the amount on energy that we in Europe are relying on, and we have made a couple of mistakes in our energy policies in the past. Not only that, a certain group of politicians tried to prevent us build, say, from hydro power stations, power plants in the Alps, just because it's against the green thing. And now we would need those plants definitely much more, and we could be self-sustainable in Austria, for example, if we had built those plants over the past 20 years. And we would not rely on alternative sources. One thing. Second thing, we have not allowed new technologies to advance. We've rather blocked them, have regulated them, or to some extent we have even subsidized them to an extent that we made those on enterprises dependent on state subsidies, and when those subsidies were withdrawn, they went bust, just because the Chinese came in, for example, with much cheaper solar panels than we in Europe were able to construct. But coming back to this original question, we in Europe were unable to be self-reliable on our energy supplies. Now we know that the German industry relies on whether it's Russian gas or other gas, but we rely on that. Just a production of energy, we need gas. And this is not only 40%, it's 60% and more. And there is energy, that there is industries, whether it's paper mills, whether it's glass production, whether it's metal production, etc. Those industries amount to 40% of the entire energy consumption, plus the consumption of energy that we need to produce energy via gas, and the rest is only private consumption households, so less than 30% all over Europe. So if we look at this amount on dependency, then we will not be able to manage that in the next 2 or 3 months. So we will still rely on other sources of energy. Having said that, our supply chains will suffer. We will reduce our economic growth, and in the end, the consumer is the one who will pay the price, which, in other words, will also trigger inflation again. So it's a vicious circle. I wish I could say something more positive about that.
It's always good to address an audience and make them feel optimistic about the future, but it's very hard to avoid the points that you've both made, particularly Barbara with her statistics about supply chains and indebtedness and failures predicted falling in GDP of most countries, particularly the former Soviet states. In terms of the the restrictions, given the degree of central planning and the challenges of socialism over the last 10 years. I'm reminded in particular of one moment when I was particularly struck by the words of Leszek Balcerowicz, you know, the famous Polish chap who was a right-hand man of Lech Walesa when Poland led the eastern countries away from Soviet rule in the late 80s. And of course, as one of the main architects of the transition in economics, it's quite easy to sit here and talk about what you'd like to see happening and what happened in the past, but to actually be tasked in the real world of politics of carrying this out. I have a lot of time for Balcerowicz. And he was giving a lecture at a private dinner, which I was privileged to be invited to in Sofia in about 2013. He was talking about the importance of being aware of creeping socialism coming back in to dominate even after he and others had led Eastern Europe away from that in '89. The big difference between people such as him from Poland and Eastern Europe, as opposed to Russians and people from the Soviet era, because of course the Soviet financial system operated for 75 years or so in Russia, so there was nobody alive who understood it at the start to deal with things when it crashed. But of course, given that it only ran for 45 years, say, in Poland, you know, Leszek as a young man had experienced this and was well equipped to take things forward in a practical sense. And he said this, he said that all of his contacts in Eastern Europe were fully aware that socialism as a economic concept lay dead and buried then in the early to mid-90s. But they didn't give up. And he said that, beware of the future. This is 10 years ago. The one thing these guys are going to fixate upon in order to drive the rise of socialism in the future is global warming.
So if I have to finish with an optimist prediction, is that because ideas have consequences, hopefully when we get the next electricity bill, we will realize that we shouldn't get our marching orders for an environmental policy either from anti-capitalists or from people who dream a return to the years back to the pre-industrial revolution, or from 16-year-old students who are political. So our Conservative Party invited Greta Thunberg in a ministerial meeting. So she was sanctioned by Conservatives. So remember this when you tell me that if only we make the economic argument, we're going to win. They sanctioned the fierce opponents of what our values should be for, and Michael Gove was there and saying, yeah, of course, sure, you have important things to say and I want to listen to you. That wasn't an optimist end, but hopefully we're going to get the lesson of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're out of time.
You need to make an announcement.
You have
Oh,
time?
yeah, the announcement. Okay, sorry. Yes, of course. So for our live audience at 9 p.m., philosopher Harry Binswanger is going to have a Q&A on the issue of discussing Jordan Peterson, so as a follow-up from last week's episode. And final parting words from Razi. Is this it? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yeah,
for
but you
joining
have
us.
to be visible.
Oh, no, people can hear me. The mic is on.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to the Austrian Economic Center for bringing the Free Market Roadshow to London and partnering with the Ayn Rand Center UK.